Hey everyone, welcome to this chess video. Here we'll be going over one of my favorite openings. You see, back when I was trying to get to 2000 for the first time, my entire opening repertoire was really based off of playing either e4, e5 or d4, d5 for both white and black. A big part of my repertoire was how do you face against the Ruy Lopez when they play e4 as white. And my response to that was, of course, the Berlin Wall. And so this game is from 2021, just about exactly 3 years ago. More or less, I want to show basically the ideas for this opening and what both sides are going to be playing for. Of course, it begins with e4. We do play e5 ourselves. Knight f3, knight c6, and then I did mention the Ruy Lopez, sometimes known as the Spanish opening, and so that is bishop to b5. And so after that, we play knight to f6, and this starts this Berlin defense. More the start of really what we're going after here is if they castle and we capture this pawn. Now they play pawn to d4, trying to rip open the center and exploit the fact that our knight might be a little bit misplaced. Perhaps a rook here, there might be a ton of pressure on our king. And so we have to be a little wary of that. So our plan continues. We come back with our knight, attacking their bishop. They trade. We play d captures, not b captures, because we want to be helping facilitate the development of our bishop. They capture with the pawn. We go knight to f5, and now the queens trade, and this is the starting position of our Berlin Wall endgame. So we are actually only on move 8, and paradoxically enough, they already consider this as actually an endgame. Even though it's all opening theory, this is taken really deeply, and so we're basically in an endgame position where queens are off the board. Now, this is important because the whole key to this opening has to go all the way back to pawn structure. And so if we take this exact position here, and I remove all of the pieces, it will look something like this. Of course, I left the kings on the board because I just want it to be a legal position. That way I can draw arrows and such. But here, only looking at the pawns. Now, just from a pawn structure perspective, we can see that white is favored here. The computer says 0.4, so that's almost half a pawn in white's favor, even though material is equal. And so why is that? It's not because of the fact this pawn is advanced. This pawn could be back here, and white is still going to be at a big advantage. It has to do with pawn structure. See, in the endgame, a very big component is the ability to create a pass pawn. Now here, white actually has 4 pawns here that are connected. This pawn is connected because this pawn can always join it, and compare that to black, who only has 3 over here. And so white's quart, which is the term for 4 pawns in a row, against black's trio, the term for 3 pawns in a row, is a pawn majority for white. And what that means is they have the potential to create a pass pawn. Specifically, if this pawn can get up to f4, maybe f5, long term they can force e6, and then there's no way that you can stop the creation of a pass pawn. Now this is really significant because the fact that white has this is not true for the other pawn majority. You see over here, black has these 4 pawns, and so white has these 3 pawns. But these 3 can actually hold off against these 4. Black cannot create a pass pawn by force, and that just has to go with studying pawn structure. This doubled pawn actually kind of hurts them here, and they have no ability to create a pass pawn like on this file. And so if white responds accordingly, they should be able to stop all attempts on that flank. And so this basically means that white has a potential for a pass pawn here on the e file, and black has no pass pawn potential. And that is a very important point. So white has all of the play from a pawn structure perspective. Now what does black have in this case? What black has is actually the pieces that are still left. Because again, I've removed the pieces, and of course in the real position, we're back here. But what is the difference? Well, primarily it is the bishop pair. The fact that we have 2 bishops and white does not. And that fact actually is pretty significant. In most positions, the bishop pair is valued roughly half a pawn. Now remember, back here it was 0.4. Right, so that's the computer's superficial evaluation, roughly half a pawn. We have the bishop pair, which is worth roughly half a pawn. And so this is more or less compensation. So where does that last 0.1 come into play? Well, that's primarily because black has an exposed king. See, back here, when I remove all the pieces, we are in an endgame, and there's very little to no chance that our king is getting checkmated here. And so the king usually wants to go up the board in an endgame, try and attack in the center, and get itself active. It is a participant in the attack. But with pieces still on the board, more of like a middle game to end game situation, where there is a little potential for checkmate, this king has to be a little bit careful about coming up the board so early. And because of that, their king isn't actually an asset here, it's a bit vulnerable. And so the question becomes, what is going to prove more superior? Is it going to be white's potential creation of a pass pawn long term? Or is it the fact that black has the bishop pair And the fact that they have an exposed king complicates things a little bit more. Now, grandmasters tend to evaluate this as slightly better for white. A big part of this opening was Vladimir Kramnik when he played against Garry Kasparov in the 2000 World Championship. He played the Berlin defense 4 different games, and in all 4 cases, he actually got a draw, which was a big deal at the time because Garry Kasparov known as one of the best attackers, and if he couldn't create a pass pawn successfully to win the game, that just shows how much defensive power this opening has as black. Now, I wasn't playing for a draw when I played this game. As with others, I played this opening to try and win. So I'm going to go over a sample game, and we'll see kind of some of these ideas in motion and kind of what it might look like in practical play. So in this opening, they actually chose to give a check, very often instead of a rook check, which is a good move, by the way, and still opening theory. What I'll see very often is a lot of players, they'll play like bishop to g5. And in a situation like this, you do not want to block with your bishop because that is a big asset of black's position. Now, the fact that they have the bishop here is a little bit deeper than that, and this is why I want to show it in a game and not just a superficial discussion, because in a real game you get to see certain things. For example, if white is to try and create a pass pawn long term, by nature of doing so, you're probably going to be opening up the position as we get more and more into an endgame and pieces get traded off further and further. But in doing so, opening up the position tends to favor the side with the 2 bishops normally. And so in this case, we have a situation where black would really want to keep the 2 bishops. Now, bishop to e7, although objectively about equal, really goes against this opening completely and not a move I would like to play. Much stronger, I think, is to play king to e8, and we continue from there, but we maintain the bishop pair. So now we get to the rook d1 move that was played in the game. And so, of course, black is going to move their king. I want to move it to e8 anyway, and so that's where we play. And the idea for white is to try and attack black's exposed king, perhaps make it more difficult to bring this rook into the game. If we imagine we developed this bishop, maybe this rook would have liked to go to e8, or possibly even d8, but it can't do that because the king is in the way. So again, white is trying to make use of the fact that black has a weak king. And so now after the check, now they go for the bishop g5 that we had recently mentioned. Now here, there's a very not so subtle threat. If we were to waste a move, they play rook to d8, and that is a checkmate. So we definitely do not want to fall for that. We have to do something. But I don't really want to cut off their bishop, because again, if I play this, then they can trade bishops, and that's a big part of potentially black's advantage long term. So what we do here instead is continue developing bishop to e6, and now this rook is actually defending the checkmate square. White continues with knight c3, and this bishop is very strong here and annoying on this diagonal, and so it's very natural to actually try and kick it away. So in the game, I played pawn to h6, and I think what would have been really good for white here is to come back all the way to d2. It looks a bit strange that you're blocking the open file on the board, but the open file is a long-term thing. The fact that one piece is in the way temporarily doesn't really make a big deal in my opinion. Say it would go something like this, maybe they bring the bishop back, I go here, and I think long-term it's still about equal and both sides have fine play. But instead of that, they only went back one square, bishop f4, and I think this gives me an extra option in the game, which I actually kind of liked, which was to play the pawn up to g5 and gain more space on that side of the board. See, I really want to deter white from long-term playing f4, and this pawn is actually deterring this. Now, I'll go back to our pawn structure thing just real briefly. In this position, and I intentionally chose to wait a little bit here, I wanted to show that if we put the very best computer moves, at least at this depth, from this endgame position, treating it like an endgame, the very top engine move is actually pawn to f4. Which makes complete sense because remember, they're trying to get a pass pawn long term, and this is how we do it. We get the pawn in front, and then it'll help support pawn to e6. Now, of course, you'll want to bring the kings up because this is an endgame, unlike with all the pieces on the board, and they still play f5. And we'll probably play c5 and try and get our king active, see if we can swing our king over this way, and, get behind this pawn. They'll move their king up, we'll play our king over, and then they play c4 just to keep us out of the square so this pawn is safe. Again, long term, trying to create a pass pawn. And so the top move here is a6, and then g4. We're not going to go too far into this, but you can see that white's entire play is reliant on forcing this pass pawn, and all of that started with playing pawn to f4, because f4 adds some very valuable support to the e5 pawn. Now we go back to our position in the real game, and you can see that my g5 move is actually long-term helping deter them from playing pawn to f4. Even if there's pieces in the way, this pawn move gaining space is going to be really tough for them. And so they bring their bishop back to the square I originally thought would have been their better square. And then here I played bishop to e7, which I think is an okay move. I was just trying to develop, get everything active. I kind of like rook to g7, looking back now, adding immediate pressure to this pawn. And I think the computer recommendation is even better. The computer recommendation is just play g4, gain even more space, and also kick the knight in the process. Now, g4 also has an extra benefit, which we'll soon see. In the real game, they played knight to e4, and if I had played g4, either last move or this move, it is continuing to keep the initiative. And with the initiative, they do not have time to move their knight. Now, I did not see any of this in the real game, and so when I continued to improve my bishop, they played a really sneaky little trick, which I did not see, completely oblivious to. They just played this knight check, which is really cool, because now my king is stuck in the center, but it's also a fork, and they'll win this bishop. Now, of course, if I take here so they don't get this bishop, well, they'll take back, and I've still lost one of my bishops. So they're actually hurting me because they're taking away my bishop here, one of the biggest assets that black has. So in the real game, I decided to capture here, and then have them capture, and then I'll capture their knight. At the very least, I can double their pawns, and so they throw in a check. I think it would have been better to just capture, accept the doubled pawns, tripled if you count this one, and just continue from there. I mean, the engine claims it's about equal, but when you throw in this check, it actually helps me play move I want to play, which is king to d7. And now my rooks are connected. And hopefully I can try and get, one of these rooks to the open file, possibly the other file, and trade everything off. And we're doing wonderful in an endgame. Perhaps this pawn might be weak and something that I can take advantage of. So they recapture. Now I get one of my rooks to the open file. They move their bishop, trying to potentially put another rook here. Now, I don't want two rooks in the middle, so I actually do decide to trade. And then I'll bring my other rook over. And if they give a check, that's no big deal. And if they trade, of course, then that's fine as well, and we're just continuing in an endgame. Now, they do trade in the game. I take back. Positionally, it's still about equal. They bring their king up. I bring my king up. It is an endgame. No worries of getting checkmated. And now they play pawn f4, which makes sense in a short-term perspective, but I think it really kind of misunderstands the position. See, it makes sense from the fact that they literally have tripled pawns, and if they can trade off one of those pawns, that probably seems good. Now, I think where this really kind of fails is the fact that their pawn majority, even if it doesn't look good, is on that side of the board. And so I think it would have been better for them to try and get their king up here, possibly behind here, and then start taking away those pawns and helping one of these pawns, maybe the h2 pawn, become a pass pawn. Now, ideally, I would like for white to try and make this f6 pawn a pass pawn, but I don't really see that happening too much. It was much better when it was on e5 and had a lot more potential for becoming a pass pawn. Here, this f7 pawn is doing a great job of stopping that. And so when they play f4, I just certainly don't want to take, right? If I take, I just feel like, it's okay, but, I'm getting a pawn, but then my structure is split, and I don't really love that too much. Looking back, I think pawn g4 would have been better, and then h5, and I think black is holding completely fine there. Now, in the real game, I played king to e6, which allows them to trade. I take back. And now what they should have done is continue to bring their king up. And they actually did that. King to f3. And if I do nothing, they'll start coming here. And, it's already trying to make progress. I would like to win material. And so I played knight to h6. And this is the key moment where they have to play very actively. Because if they don't, my plan is to bring my knight here and simply win this pawn. Now, what they really have to do is they probably need to play something like bishop to d2, threaten this pawn, and then, if I come back, they can take here, and I can take here, and it's just an equal trade. Maybe h2 has pass pawn potential, and we go from there. They actually played h3, maybe trying to fix this pawn if my knight moves, but the problem is this is just too slow. And so I bring my king up to defend my pawn, and then I'll relocate my knight. So we do a little relocating. I push b6 to prevent them from capturing at a7. They move their king over, and now I capture here. And really, we see their king kind of going to the wrong side of the board. Because here, I have 4 pawns, they have 3 pawns. It makes sense if I play on that side of the board, even if long-term I don't have the potential for a pass pawn. White really should have been playing on this side of the board. But, of course, here, that wouldn't be so easy either. Now, they move their bishop back. I improve my knight. Now, they probably saw the potential check on b4, so they control that square with their bishop, so that way there's no check to their king winning a pawn. But now I can go the other way, so I'll play knight to f4, this is a check, and if they don't take, then I'm going to win this pawn, and this pawn is going to be very strong. So they do capture, I capture back, and being up a pawn, this should be an easy endgame to convert from here. So they just move their king, I bring my pawn up. I think f5 was actually even more active, and then trying to get perhaps g4 in. But we just simply go after the pawns, we trade a bit, and then after I get this, then this pawn is just too strong, and we can see that it's going to be over very quickly. Now in this position they resigned, but that was a good practical example you can see of how this endgame might come up. And of course no side is going to play it perfectly, you know, even grandmasters will sometimes mess up. Now to my opponent's credit, they actually played with a 87% accuracy according to chess.com. My accuracy was actually 95, but I think really that's because they didn't play it perfectly at a few key moments, and that really helped me get the advantage. I think really one of the biggest takeaways here you have to understand is, from a pawn structure perspective, white really should be playing on the 4-3 majority that they have here on this side of the board. So I hope this was an instructional example to give you a little bit more insight into how the Berlin endgame works. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.